Okay, so besides history, mythology has always been a guilty pleasure of mine. And boy have I been waiting to do this topic for a while. As a function of popularity, Roman mythos isn't nearly as popular as its Greek counterpart, since the Romans were more preoccupied with empire building and Caesar killing than they were with their oral traditions. But they did name the planets after their deities, which is nice. Okay, so the Romans borrowed heavily from the Greek pantheons and also appropriated many of their homegrown deities into Greek equivalents. The Italian peninsula had been in contact with the Greeks for centuries, and Greek colonies were spread throughout the Mediterranean, so this was somewhat inevitable. To get some of the bigger famous gods out of the way, the Roman pantheon corresponded mostly with the third Greek dynasty called the Olympians. Zeus, Hera, and Athena became Jupiter, Juno, and Minerva respectively, the three patron gods of Rome. Ares, Aphrodite, and Poseidon became Mars, Venus, and Neptune. Hermes, with his cool winged shoes, became Mercury, the god of communication, transport, and commerce. The famous Titan equivalents are the first gods Uranus of the sky and Gaia of the earth, who, through their marriage, bore Saturn, one of the oldest and most famous gods of Roman mythology. Saturn was hugely important to the Romans, as he reigned the supreme deity and father of Jupiter, corresponding to his Greek equivalent Kronos. The age of Latin dominance over Italy is said to be attributed to him, and his name lives on in the planet Saturn and the sixth day of the week, Saturday. The winter solstice festival became dedicated to him in the month of December as Saturnalius, or Saturn Festival, and Christmas was later moved to December 25th to coincide with it, illustrating just how important it was to the Romans. Hades, the Greek god of the underworld, would become Pluto. Hephaestus, the Greek god of fire, became Vulcan, where the modern word volcano comes from. The odd one out was Apollo, who seems to have blended over time with some other deities. Classic Roman mythology places him with Greek Apollo, the son of Jupiter. But Apollo was also worshipped for many other things, and it's hard to pin down. He is portrayed as the patron god of Troy, which would later make him very important to the Romans. The Trojans worshipped him as the sun god, which seems to correspond with the Italian Etruscan god Sol, but also at various times been associated with Helios, who is not an Olympian but a Titan like Saturn, who is famous for drawing the sun across the sky in his chariot. All these inconsistencies were hand-waved somewhat, as the customs, festivals, and worship mattered a lot more to the Italians than the myths or the stories. But don't take my word for it, I wasn't there. Of the stories, there are some good ones. Hercules was adopted from the Greek hero Heracles, the son of Zeus and a mortal woman. Heracles was an immensely influential character in Roman times, and his stories feature heavily. Besides the well-known 12 tasks, Heracles also has stories featuring him in the Roman Empire, such as killing Vulcan's son Casus, the fire-breathing giant, or when he visited Germany with some of the locals identifying him as Thor. Hercules is said to have visited a town on the southern shores of Gaul and chased away the gods that were terrifying the locals. In honor of him, they built the temple of Hercules Maniakos, which I'm sure you've pieced together eventually became Monaco. Many of these stories were compiled into literature, the most famous of which was the Aeneid, an epic saga containing the founding myths of Rome. Virgil, the poet and writer, was commissioned by Caesar Augustus to write an epic poem about himself and his glorious life. To which Virgil said sure, and then immediately began work compiling a historical epic on the history of Rome, to stick it to Augustus, who he didn't like very much. Virgil compiled several stories and sources relating to Rome's history into one epic saga spanning 3 continents and many years, initially meaning to serve as a sequel to Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, but also heavily borrowing from both. The Aeneid, much like the Odyssey, picks up soon after the Trojan War, with Aeneas, a Trojan warrior and son of Venus, tasked with taking the Trojan survivors and finding them a new home. Either that or he ran away, sources disagree. The Trojan refugees took a fleet of ships and began their epic quest to find their prophesied new home of Italy. This being far too mortal a quest, the gods couldn't help themselves by getting involved. Aeneas' journey was interfered by competing gods who either did or did not want the Trojans to find a new home. Juno, Jupiter's wife, or niece, depending who you ask, was particularly ruthless in her attempt to stop Aeneas from getting to Italy, since it was foretold that his descendants would one day destroy and conquer Carthage, her all-time favorite city. Neptune, the god of the sea, helped the Trojan fleet by halting a storm sent by Juno, but not before it had blown them all the way to Libya. With some more divine intervention, eventually Aeneas made it to Carthage, where he stayed for 6 years, married the queen of Carthage, Dido, and generally became content, before a strongly worded suggestion from Jupiter via Mercury, who told Aeneas to get off his butt and start sailing again. The Trojans would quietly sneak off one night, and Aeneas would abandon his wife, angering her so much that she cursed Aeneas and vowed that Carthage will always be an enemy to his descendants. This is what those in the writer's business call foreshadowing. After a brief stop in Sicily, Aeneas finally arrives on the shore of Italy, and after a visit to the underworld, he learns of his destiny to become the father of the Roman Empire. So, no pressure. Hopping on his boat again, the Trojans settled the Italian kingdom of Latium and immediately started a war. Seriously, the rest of the book is just war between competing suitors to the Latin princess's hand. Tiberinus, god of the Tiber River and son of the Titan Oceanus, helped Aeneas in the war. He once again assured Aeneas that Italy was to be his home and that he should found a settlement and become father to the world's greatest empire. Aeneas then founded the city of Alba Longa in Latium and became its first king. His descendants would rule the city until the birth of the princess Rhea Silva. Rhea became pregnant with the sons of the Roman god Mars, eventually giving birth to twins she named Romulus and Remus. Their granduncle, the king of Elba, saw them as a threat to his rule and ordered them killed, whereupon they were thrown into the Tiber River to die. Tiberinus then rescued the twins, and a she-wolf found the boys and suckled them to keep them alive. The boys grew up in an area of 7 hills and became great warriors, and after learning who they were, they led a revolt against the king, their uncle, who had himself usurped the throne from Romulus and Remus's grandfather Numitor. With Numitor back on the throne, the twins returned to the 7 hills they were raised on. A disagreement on where to settle down led to a fight between the two, and Romulus killed his brother. Romulus then created a settlement and named it after himself, Rome, and reigned as its first king. And that is how the Trojan refugees would live on to become the legendary founders of the Roman Empire. The Italian peninsula was a thriving hotbed of prehistoric civilizations, with all the basics of Bronze Age society such as metalwork and agriculture. By the time the Iron Age came around in the 8th century, these had coalesced into 2 dominant cultures, the Etruscans in the north and the Greeks in the south, who had settled the area slowly over time. These two shared writing, religion, and culture with one another, having a massive influence over Italy. Their culture wouldn't last very long, however, because they were soon to be eclipsed by... Founded on the river between the Etruscans and a tribe called the Latins, Rome soon prospered and grew very powerful largely thanks to its strategic and defensible location, and they were ruled by 7 legendary kings. The last of these kings, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, also known as the Bad One, was overthrown by the people when his son raped a nobleman's wife. The scandal would force monarchy out of Rome, eventually collapsing the Roman kingdom completely. In its place, the Republic was born, ruled not by a king, but rather 2 consuls selected by the Senate. Roman society was divided into 2 parts, the patricians, who were nobles, and the plebeians, everyone else, who were represented in the Senate by an elected office called the tribune. The tribune was granted the power of veto, meaning the patrician Senate and the plebeians often had to work together on policies that benefited both classes, contributing to Rome's success. Under the republican system, Rome prospered. They expanded their territory through both conquest and alliance, often being reluctantly dragged into wars in defense of one of its allies, who then made territorial concessions or became a client state in return. This cycle continued, and soon Rome became the ruling state over most of Italy, and Latin became the lingua franca, or common tongue. A rather small domestic dispute in the city-states of Sicily dragged Rome into an open conflict with Carthage, known as the First Punic War, which they ultimately won. The political fallout from this war was immense, and the 2 sides hated each other from that day forward. After 2 more Punic Wars, in which Rome was very nearly defeated by the Carthaginian leader Hannibal, Rome destroyed Carthage and annexed most of her territories. The Senate became more and more interested in securing Rome's place in the Mediterranean basin to ensure another Hannibal never threatened Rome again. This would bring them to war with the 3 dominant Greek kingdoms. The city of Carthage and Corinth were both completely destroyed in 146 BC, and Rome became the undisputed naval power of the Mediterranean. Fast forwarding a bit to everyone's favorite Gaius Julius Caesar. An ambitious politician and military leader, Caesar eventually landed a gig as the governor of Gaul. When recalled to Rome for his abundant abuses of power, Caesar made a huge power grab in returning to Italy with an army, plunging Rome into civil war. After Pompey's death, Caesar attained all political positions he could, effectively becoming a dictator and emperor. As you may remember, the Romans weren't all too fond of monarchy, so you can guess what happened. With Caesar's corpse on the Roman Senate, the nation was again plunged into civil war between Caesar's adopted son Octavian and Mark Antony, paving the way not only for the Roman Empire but also 2 very interesting Shakespeare ripoffs. Octavian, the winner, was renamed Augustus, and his reign would soon be followed by the continuation of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, and a 2-century-long absence of war called the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, interrupted only occasionally by a few emperors whose mental faculties have been called into question. Rome became the birthplace of the Roman Catholic Church. Ironically, however, in the early days, Italy was very unsafe for Christians, who were frequently persecuted and blamed for many tragedies, including a great fire in the heart of Rome. After one succession crisis, the Flavian dynasty was established, ushering in a new era, famous for making Italy more diverse and multicultural, and the building of its most famous monument, the Colosseum, giving the Roman people the two simplest of life's pleasures: panem et circenses, bread and circuses. A volcano also destroyed the city of Pompeii, but I don't think the Flavians had anything to do with that. The Flavians were replaced by the Aeneid dynasty, famous for its 5 good emperors. Rome reached its zenith under this period both culturally and territorially. Commodus, the last of this dynasty, was assassinated by a gladiator named Narcissus, beginning, you guessed it, yet another succession crisis. The Severan dynasty would usher in a period called the crisis of the 3rd century, where the number one cause of death for Roman emperors became assassination, not exactly a recipe for political stability. Rome would soon become very decentralized with time, being victims of globalization, cheap slave labor, inflation, and legionaries of barbarians who were more loyal to their generals who paid them than to Rome. 26 emperors were proclaimed in half a century, and the empire became politically split in half, and even the capital of the empire was moved to the Greek city Byzantium, later renamed Constantinople, illustrating just how volatile the city of Rome was becoming. Huns and Germanic tribes began to raid and sack the western half almost routinely, and the combined army were less able to mount a significant defense using their legions, since, hey, what did Rome ever do for them? The empire in the west would soon collapse completely by the 5th century. In its place, the barbarian Odoacer set up the more recognizable Kingdom of Italy, soon ruled by the Germanic Ostrogoths. The Ostrogothic kingdom began a cultural exchange between the Latin and Germanic world, leaving huge imprints, especially in northern Italy where they had established deeper roots. The empire, however, continued to live on in the east. Eastern Roman Emperor Justinian, with dreams of uniting the empire, conquered the Ostrogothic kingdom in 553, once again bringing the Roman imperial light back to Italy and back to Rome. The migration period didn't stop with the Ostrogoths. Around the same time, 2 tribes called the Lombards and the Franks had slowly moved southward in search of new land. The Lombards found themselves squeezed between the emerging Frankish kingdoms and nomadic invaders under the Avars, forcing them ever more southward. The Lombards slowly moved into central Italy, conquering the tired and war-ravaged countryside. They set up the Kingdom of Lombardy as well as 2 semi-autonomous duchies in the south, making Italy look a lot more like a jigsaw puzzle than anything resembling a nation. The Byzantines struggled to maintain control of the area but retained at least nominal territory. The popes in Rome began securing this section under their direct control. Thousands of Italian refugees fled the countryside from the Lombard invasions and settled in the Venetian lagoon, eventually becoming the legendary founders of Venice, the floating city. The Pope signed an alliance with the Carolingian Franks and teamed up to fight the Lombards. In return, the leader Charlemagne was crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor, and the Papal States were granted full independence. The popes also built walls around the Vatican to keep out pesky Arab raiders. Speaking of which, the Islamic Umayyads and the Abbasids began conquering parts of Sicily and Sardinia, the latter of which actually managed to repel their attacks, setting up independent states called the Judicati. Who saw that coming, right? Charlemagne's Frankish Empire splintered after his death but was soon united by Otto I in Germany. The south was being conquered by the Normans while the Lombard kingdoms fractured into civil war. Around the same time, the maritime republics began to increase in power and wealth. I'll go into more detail about these republics in a separate video since it gets pretty complicated. The House of Habsburg inherited much of the Italian lands, putting them in personal union with many foreign rulers. Some of these rulers, like the Spanish Habsburgs and the French, fought a series of devastating wars in among the states of Italy for control over the peninsula, called the Italian Wars, only further establishing Habsburg control over the area. The Catholic Counter-Reformation of Catholic states against Protestant states began the 30 Years' War, which is one of the deadliest conflicts of all time. Over in the east, the Byzantines had recently fallen to the Ottoman Turks, and the Italian republics took in many intellectual refugees who brought with them many long-forgotten Greco-Roman books and culture. The rich Italian cities had the money to waste on translating these books, resulting in the Renaissance, a rebirth of classical period culture. The Renaissance would also stimulate learning and the Enlightenment, bringing Europe out of the so-called Dark Ages. The Enlightenment ideas became Italy's largest export, from faraway Moscow to nearby Paris. In Paris, it stimulated the French Revolution. As an unintended consequence, in the 1800s, Napoleon's armies invaded Italy in his war with the Habsburgs. So, win some, lose some, I guess. In the Congress of Vienna, the borders were redrawn again following Napoleon's defeat. But the birth of an Italian national consciousness, as well as centuries of foreign rule, stimulated the unification wars, and the Kingdom of Sardinia spent the better part of the next century conquering the rest of Italy from the French and Austrian royal houses, under King Victor Emmanuel II and his famous general Giuseppe Garibaldi, finally unifying it into a modern nation-state. Except for the Pope, who was still hiding behind his walls. The newly united Kingdom of Italy joined the Triple Alliance with Austria and Germany. However, when the First World War broke out in the Balkans, the Italians remained neutral, only switching sides to the Entente in 1915 in exchange for promises of new land. They opened up a large front against Austria in the Alpine passes but made very little progress. A joint offensive in 1917 of British, French and Italian forces finally managed to put pressure on the crumbling Austria-Hungary. The war ravaged the young state, amounting some 650,000 casualties and more than 1 million wounded. In exchange, they were granted far less territory than they realized, and the country was plagued with economic decline. This left Italy feeling alienated from their Western allies. A young socialist named Benito Mussolini, himself a soldier in the war, used the turmoil to create a new ultra-nationalist movement called Fascismo. Mussolini was eager to expand Italy's holdings in Africa to prove his nation's racial superiority, a new Roman Empire. So, in 1922, he and the fascists orchestrated a coup, the March on Rome, installing Mussolini as dictator. Not long after, the fascist ideas and groups began springing up all over Europe, including Spain and especially Germany, where its philosophy laid the framework of National Socialism. Mussolini found a friend in Adolf Hitler, and they soon formed an alliance based on mutual support. Although both Hitler and other European leaders viewed Mussolini as weak and opportunistic. In 1940, Italy declared war on France and Britain, officially entering the Second World War. However, a lack of resources and tactical errors meant that advancing into France was pretty stagnant. The Italians also fought in North Africa, Albania and Greece, but had to be aided by the Germans to overcome the enemy. The joint invasion of Yugoslavia went very well for the Axis, bringing the whole of the Balkans under their control. The extra troops and resources diverted to the south disrupted plans for the Nazi invasion of the USSR, delaying the operation for over a month. Historians believe this to be a contributing factor in the Wehrmacht failure to capture Moscow and beating the start of winter, since the invasion was launched so late. The Italian army contributed some 230,000 troops to the invasion, with about 90,000 estimated casualties. Italy was invaded by a joint Allied force in 1943, which soon pushed their way up toward Rome. Italy surrendered and Mussolini was deposed, but the Germans invaded from the north to secure their southern flank. It is during this campaign that the Wehrmacht killed thousands of civilians and POWs, including over 7,000 Jews. The decisive battle at Monte Cassino was an Allied victory, leading to yet another Allied advance. Mussolini was captured at the border of Switzerland trying to escape. The anti-fascist populace then executed him, shortly before the end of the war. In 1946, the Italian countryside, ravaged again by war and famine, was given a referendum to establish a republic. The monarchy was abolished and the country became part of the Western democratic sphere of the Cold War. The communist members of parliament were expelled in 1947. However, the young republic suffered from economic hardship, especially in the south, causing many to emigrate for better opportunities elsewhere, such as the USA, Argentina, and Australia. Italy became a founding member of NATO, the European Coal and Steel Community, and its eventual counterpart, the European Union. Today, Italy still suffers from economic hardship as well as a large wage gap, but the economy is still growing. The switch to the euro in 1999 brought with it cheaper loans and investment opportunities. Italy is one of the most visited countries in the world, with Milan, Venice, Rome, Naples, Genoa, and Florence being huge cultural and economic hubs, with some of Europe's most successful companies. After 24 years spent in the court of Kublai Khan in China, an aged and immeasurably wealthy Marco Polo returns to his native homeland in Venice. He finds the city's martial banner raised, with St. Mark's lion holding a sword instead of a Bible. Venice is at war. Polo is captured by the enemy, Genoa, and from his prison cell he writes of his adventures in the Far East. Italian history cannot be fully understood without talking about the Maritime republics whose contribution to the economy and politics of the Italian peninsula was almost immeasurable. Chief among them were the megalithic trade rivals Genoa and Venice. The city-states of Italy were birthed by warfare. The struggle between the Byzantines and the Lombards for control of Italy meant that the coastal trade cities were left to fend for themselves more often than not, building high walls to protect them from mainland armies, and large navies to protect their trade networks from Muslim and Saracen pirates. The Byzantines granted self-governing status to Amalfi, Gaeta, Venezia, Ancona, and also eventually Ragusa, while the Holy Roman Empire did the same for the cities of Genova and Pisa. War is not good for business, so overland trade routes were pretty much defunct at this point, allowing for the growth and prosperity of the ocean-going trade routes. You'll remember from the previous episode that warfare was so widespread that it even features in the founding legend of Venice. These cities were called republics because they elected their leaders, such as the Doge, Italian for duke, who was usually under large influence by the aristocratic merchant families. As time wore on, two of these republics would come to dominate their rivals for trade on either side of the peninsula, Genoa and Venice. Now, Venice was of particular importance to Italy as this floating city water fortress became filthy rich with trade as well as with her exploits during the Crusades to the Holy Land.
But if you're wondering how this tiny speck of islands became so fabulously wealthy in the first place, then we've got to talk about the unique brand of mercantilism that Venice was famous for, and it comes down to three main factors. The first is geography, as Venice and Genoa sat at the far northern edge of the Mediterranean, meaning they could get goods far into Europe without breaking the bank on slow, expensive, and dangerous overland transit. The added benefit to Venice here is that they were able to dominate the narrow Adriatic Sea, whereas Genoa was just facing out into the open Mediterranean. By controlling those waterways, Venice took nearly half of Italy out of competition. The second factor is trade partnerships, as Venice, and to a lesser extent Genoa too, was tolerant and cooperative with merchants in the Muslim world even during the Crusades. In addition to that, since Venice was a direct offshoot of the Byzantine Empire, the two were buddy-buddy from the very start. Genoa also had these relationships, but it always played second fiddle because it was smack in the middle of major European powers and all of the wars they fought with each other, making Venice the safer option to bet on with regards to trade. The last factor, and the one that really puts it over the edge for Venice, was their government. Even though both cities were run by a republic, Genoa's economy operated through private merchants and banks, whereas Venetian commerce was coordinated by the government itself. But here's the kicker. The Grand Council was overwhelmingly made up of merchants, so when the state dictated travel itineraries and shipping manifests, or subsidized the construction of a public merchant fleet, it all worked because everyone knew what they needed to succeed. And on a more individual level, the government provided loans for up-and-coming merchants as well as commerce insurance. It's honestly a little shocking how many modern-sounding instruments of economics and trade were invented by the Venetians in the Middle Ages. So if we look at the whole picture, Genoa fell just short of Venice in the cases of geography and partnerships, but on the subject of government, the Venetians blew Genoa right out of the water. At every step, Venice worked together to achieve an unfathomable level of economic efficiency. From this, it's easy to see why these two cities arose as the powerhouses they did, and why Venice went on to become the unchallenged economic champion of the coming Renaissance.
Hey, thanks for your help, Blue.
Anytime. Talking about all this Venetian history helps justify those years of suffering in economics classes. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go, find my arms. Later!
So why are Genoa and Venice so important to understanding Italian history? Firstly, they became the economic powerhouse of the Eastern and Western Mediterranean respectively, subsuming the influence of the other republics until they eventually were butting heads with each other. They were also the go-to shipbuilders for crusaders, meaning they had a huge impact on the campaigns to the Holy Land. only further expanding their influence. The trade networks were so vast that it is thought that the Genoese trading station of Caffa brought the Black Death to Europe on the rats that lived in the hulls of merchant ships. Genoese bankers became the most elite in Europe and even became a pawn for the ambitions of other states for control over Italy, including most famously the House of Aragon and France. Arguably the most famous Genoan was Cristoforo Colombo, a sailor and navigator who pioneered the use of a navigation technique called dead reckoning to try and find a western route to India, eventually discovering the New World, previously unknown to Europeans. Venice, on the other hand, had fared much better in the Middle Ages. The Venetian merchants agreed to participate in the Fourth Crusade, which ended up never reaching the Holy Land and getting disastrously involved in a Byzantine succession crisis. But after not getting paid by the broke Byzantine Empire, the Crusaders and Venetians sacked the city of Constantinople and divided the empire into a series of successor states, with Venice being awarded many new colonies in the Aegean. Their continued presence in Greece allowed them to become the main connection between Europe and the Middle East, which set up the highway for intellectual migration of ancient Greek humanism that would lead to the Renaissance. These trade routes were largely kept open when Constantinople fell to the Ottomans, and the Italian city-states started taking in thousands of intellectual refugees from the formerly Roman territory. These very important links would help birth the Enlightenment, as Venetians established connections with Persian and Arabic scholars and scientists, something that was sorely lacking during the previous centuries of crusading zeal. The growth of the Ottoman Empire eventually led to the Venetian monopoly on a lucrative spice trade in the Far East, which would directly result in the stimulus for the Dutch, Portuguese, and Spanish to seek new routes to India, and the accidental discovery of the New World. Between 1256 and 1381, the Genoese and the Venetians had fought 4 separate wars for trade dominance, usually involving the crumbling Byzantine Empire. The dominance of these republics would eventually come to an end when the Atlantic powers basically put them out of business, but also during the period of the 30 Years' War and the Italian Wars, which effectively destroyed mainland markets, especially for Venice. As said before, war is not usually good for business. Venice and Genoa would both be abolished during the French Revolutionary Wars and the Napoleonic Wars, when they became dominated by the rising European powers of France and Austria in 1797.